Turkish units on their way to battle literally melted into nothing as many soldiers froze to death.
What the hell?
And one report
Nigga!
has a division losing 40% of its troops in a snowstorm. Pasha himself got information.
Okay, Ottoman disaster.
Over the past few months,
I hope this is the right video, but I was suggested this video.
As the new year rolls in, we see something we haven't seen yet. The annihilation of an entire army.
Why is quality like that? Turn it into HD.
Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we saw the fighting go quiet on much of the Western Front as the soldiers of both sides celebrated a spontaneous Christmas truce. The rest
I don't really do much of these.
It was business as usual as the French army's newest offensive kicked into gear along a wide front. On the Eastern Front, it was mostly quiet. You might be thinking too quiet, and you might be right, as the German, Russian, and Austrian armies regrouped for the new year. And in the highlands of northeastern Turkey and the Caucasus, the Ottoman army was marching through the freezing snows to meet the Russian juggernaut. Here's how it all went. The French army's new offensive was called the Champagne Offensive, and it was now in its second week. It would continue into the new year. As much of the rest of the war was, it was an exercise in futility. The Allies attacking points of tactical importance in concentrated bursts along a wide front and taking trenches and positions from the Germans, and then the Germans, days or even hours later, taking those same points back from the Allies.
Wow.
Back and forth, again and again.
That's mad.
Thousands of men dying for temporary gains of only a few dozen meters. But French General Joseph Joffre really needed this offensive. See, Germany held a large chunk of the industrial heartland of France and were only less than 100 kilometers from Paris. To keep up morale, he simply had to attack and couldn't just adopt a defensive posture and then wait and see what the Germans would do. So the back and forth continued in frustration and futility as it would for weeks. So 1915 begins on the trenches of the Western Front with more of the same. But I'm going to move away from death for a minute and talk about some more general forces, like economics. Specifically, the British blockade of German exports. Now, in the past, with British wars against, say, Napoleon, what would happen is that the British Navy would completely cut off French trade with the rest of the world, right? The French would then have to create substitute industries, which were of inferior quality and took a lot of money. And it would screw up the French economy, while the British overseas trade monopoly generated tons of money with which the British would pay the Russians and the Austrians to do most of the land fighting against the French. That was
yeah. Yep.
1814. Britain figured that the same would work in 1914 and 1915, that stopping German exports would stop Germany. But Britain could not have been more wrong. And when exports were stopped, there was nothing like the expected riots in Hamburg. Instead, the colossus of German industry adapted well to refitting for wartime production with no loss of quality. And actually,
that's actually mad.
The German economy, with the blockade, would do better than all of the other warring nations in 1915. There was also a big side bonus.
But the thing is, though, I mean, I did not. Wow. Okay. Damn. But I mean, with hindsight, we all know that the blockade did eventually, like, really fucked up Germany, like, really bad.
For the Germans, the blockade was a great excuse for any issues with food and other supplies that may happen to become scarce. So the British were hated for scarcities that were not even of their making. They didn't stop any imports anyhow.
That's
since
funny.
These could go through neutral ports like the Netherlands, and international law prohibited blocking imports. But the blockade on exports continued. It certainly wasn't the only blockade anyhow. All of the seas all around Europe were blocked in one way or another by one party or another. Heck, look at Russian shipping, for example. The White Sea now frozen in the north, and the Black Sea a prison in the south as they were hemmed in by the Ottoman Empire. And this week, actually, things that had been building between the Russians and the Ottomans finally came to a head. Okay, last week at Christmas, we saw the Ottoman Imperial Army, nearly 150,000 strong, including soldiers and staff, well armed but poorly equipped, suffering terribly from exhaustion and hypothermia, marching through the high mountain passes of northeastern Turkey towards Sarikamish to try to knock the Russians out of the Caucasus. This Turkish offensive was the brainchild of Enver Pasha, Turkish Minister of War, a modernist who brought the Ottoman Empire into the war pretty much single-handedly and sought to build a new Turkey with a new national identity. Pasha chose to undertake this specific offensive for several reasons. Its distance from the Eastern Front was important, of course. It would be hard for Russia to reinforce the Caucasus all the way from Poland. And the Russian Caucasus army had been stripped of a lot of men who'd been sent north in the first place. But there was another big thing here. Pasha really believed this would have an emotional importance not only to Turks, but other peoples as well. Russian rule in the Caucasus had been imposed often brutally for over 100 years on the various people living there. Pasha thought that when he attacked, they would rally to his cause, but the problem was that by 1915, they were waking up to their own national identities. Within the past 40 years, a bunch of nations had actually been liberated from the Ottoman Empire: Serbia, Albania, Romania, and so forth. And the Arabs and Kurds saw this and had their own national agendas. And actually, Kurds in the Ottoman army sometimes even deserted and joined the Russians, having themselves been often brutally repressed by the Ottomans. So things weren't at all in reality as Pasha believed them to be.
Don't you love history? Don't you love, oh my fucking god, the irony of history, bro.
And the scene of the battles is a bad place to attack geographically in general, but Pasha compounded this. He attacked in winter, when temperatures can drop below -20 even at low altitudes. But during the campaign, we're far lower.
That is so
there was
bad.
only a single railway, and the roads were covered in snow. So his supply line was complete chaos, and artillery couldn't get through.
This was a disaster before it even began.
It also didn't help that Enver Pasha thought the Russians were retreating to Kars. They weren't. Still, the Turks persevered, and the actual clash with the Russians at Sarikamish finally took place December 29th. Two army corps, over 10,000 strong, attacked, but failed to break into the city and lost about half their numbers. Over the next week, the Turks would keep pressing against Sarikamish to no avail, even as the Russians brought in more troops and began their counterattack. Turkish units on their way to battle literally melted into nothing as many soldiers froze to death.
What the hell?
And one report
Nigga
has a division losing 40% of its troops in a snowstorm. Pasha himself got information that the Russians were attempting to surround the Turks, but he continued the attack anyway. By January 2nd, Pasha's field leaders said they were too weak to continue the assaults. Pasha
shaking
they do so anyway.
My head, bro. Oh my gosh.
Now had the Turks in a semicircle and were closing the net. An entire Turkish corps surrendered, and by January 4th, the Turkish army was in retreat towards Erzurum, with the Russians now on their heels. The retreat and counterattack would continue for another 2 weeks, but I'm going to go ahead and throw some numbers at you right now. According to John Keegan, by mid-January, only 18,000 of the 95,000 Turks who actually fought the campaign survived, but it may have been even worse. Pasha's
what the hell? Bruh, that's whole what? Bruh, I'm speechless. I don't even know what to say. That's what though. That's like, I don't even know. That's just bad, bro. That's just
hands-on offensive had been
horrible.
A complete disaster, and his army was totally destroyed. But his
destroyed? No, annihilated, bro.
Failures were so obvious. I mean, how many thousands of men, more than half, weren't even killed by the enemy, but froze to death in the snows long before they'd even got to battle.
Yeah, that's
such a colossal.
That's holy shit. That's the wildest part about all of this, Bren.
So that's where we stand as 1915 begins. Constant, never-ending attacks and counterattacks on the Western Front. The Russians moving into position to attack the passes in the Carpathian Mountains in the east. And an entire army destroyed, needlessly wasted, poorly supplied, marched to exhaustion, and finally freezing to death far from home in the snows of eastern Turkey and the Caucasus. Pasha never led in the field again after Sarikamish, but he did retain his position. We've spoken before of Enver Pasha.
Yeah, I said this guy was trash. This guy was so fucking incompetent, and this has showed that.
Dreams for a modern Turkey, but we've never seen the staggering scale of his incompetence or his willingness to sacrifice huge numbers of his countrymen to achieve his nebulous goals. Actually, the deviousness with which he brought the Ottoman Empire into the war in the first place should have sent off warning signals that this man was capable of anything. But only now, as the new year begins, do we begin to see the results. It's not going to get better, and I'm going to end this episode with one more statistic. Thanks in large part to Enver Pasha, during the First World War, 1/4 of the entire population of Turkey would die. If you'd like to see more...
Wait, did I hear that correctly?
Die. 1/4 of the entire population of Turkey would die.
Yo! I didn't know it was that. What?
If you'd like to see more about Enver Pasha and how he brought the Ottoman Empire into the war in the first place...
Dog. Short video, but good video. If you have suggestions like this, I mean, shit, man. Comment it if you like my reactions, bruh. Eventually, I will do it. You know, active members, like I said before, check out my channel membership. I purposely made it 99 cents a month. I purposely made it cheap so that my active members could keep in touch with me. Like I said, as I get more subscribers, more viewers, you know, I have things to do outside of my YouTube channel. You know, it's going to be hard for me to keep up with everybody, okay? So the membership is there. And I purposely made it cheap in case you just want to keep ties. You get perks too, such as faster reply to comments. The video suggestions are done faster. Early access to uploads and a whole bunch of other perks, man. Like I said, as we get more members, I'm going to expand perks. Right now we have 8 members. Yeah. This video is mad. I ain't gonna lie to you. So, like I said, like the video, subscribe. If you made it all the way here and you're new, check out my other reactions on my channel. Thank you for watching and goodbye.